Hey, welcome to the Coffee with the Doctors podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Chris,
And I'm Dr. Liesel.
and we shine a light on the powerful scholarship emerging from Michigan's practitioner scholars working in K-12 schools. Each episode, we sit down with educators, leaders, and researchers whose work is shaping classrooms, guiding policy, and transforming communities.
So grab your coffee or other preferred morning beverage, settle in, and join us as we elevate the voices, ideas, and innovations driving Michigan's educational future. All right. So, Chris, first of all, I hear you're not drinking coffee this
All right,
morning.
Dr.
We're exactly
Carlson.
going to get into that one.
Okay, okay. All right, all right,
I don't know.
all right. Dr. Carlson, I'll give you, listen, you know, when you turn 37, things happen to your body, and your body begins to let you know you can't just pound 6 cups of coffee a day. It just don't work the same way. You want me to tell you what we're gonna do for the show, though?
Yes. Will
All
you
right.
tell me what's on the agenda for this week? I just had to get that in there.
All right, so look, last week we talked about the West Side as the treasure trove of the state. For this episode of Coffee with the Doctors, we'll be headed back to the southeast corner of the state, to Motown City itself, the home of some of the state's crown jewels and prized possessions. You know, Better Made Chips, Verner's, the Detroit Pistons, Detroit Public Television, and of course, Dr. Omar Hakim.
We are so excited to have Dr. Omar on today. And as Chris said, he is currently the VP of Education, Kids, and Learning at Detroit Public Television. Before his work there, Dr. Omar served as a teacher, curriculum, and instructional leader in a few different Southeast Michigan districts, as well as he's been a Fulbright International Scholar and Harvard Fellowship recipient. Wow, all of that in the last 25 years. That's a lot.
Wow. All right. Well, Dr. Omar, we usually like to start off the question with one, or the show off with one quick question. It goes like this. And I feel weird now that Liesel has outed me for
Totally.
my coffee selections. But do you like Folgers or Fair Trade coffee?
All
Or
right. Well, good morning to both. And so I want to know what's in your coffee cup. If it's not coffee, is going to be my
oh,
next question. But I'm going to say with coffee, I'm inclusive. So fair
uh,
trade is my preferred. But if Folgers is available or whatever is
okay.
available, I mean, I still need my daily coffee.
That is a good answer. I will say I am sipping on a blend of Rubio's tea and chicory root. Um, just to try to wean myself off. I will have some caffeine a little bit later. But we usually start off the show with that question because the whole inspiration for the Coffee with the Doctor show is just this idea that we used to get in the habit of waking up every morning. Sometimes it was at 4 a.m., 5 a.m., and of course, as you are getting the hang of, 7 a.m., and we would drink coffee and do our research for our dissertation of practice during our time at Michigan State University's Doctorate of Educational Leadership. Hey, that just is a timely plug for them. We just do it all the time. And mind you, friends, we're not getting any swag for saying it, but we usually we get into those rhythms, or we got into those rhythms as a result of that program. So we want to start off the show by asking you during your program in your time at MSU, what was your persistent problem or the dilemma that you sought to understand to address your research?
All right. So for me, I had a little bit of an interesting journey because I started out actually in the PhD program in the curriculum instruction and teacher education space. And I was there full time. While I loved it, I also was missing the direct connection to the work. And so I saw what was happening with the EDD program and felt like my work was, and the future of what I wanted to do was going to be actualized, in spaces on the ground outside of um, like a researcher university faculty role. So um, joined the program, and at the heart of sort of what we were thinking about was, how do we honor students as the heart of our profession? So many times, I would say most times, when you ask people like why they've entered the field, or what do they love most about teaching, it's usually like that moment a student lights up, right? And they're inspired, and their education has meant something to them in a way that's going to impact their lives. And so um, we really wanted to honor that and think about, like, as the world around schools is changing so rapidly,
Yeah.
um, how do we think about school innovation in a
Yeah.
way that includes students in the process of what schools look like? Which, given the traditional structures of school, I think, unfortunately and inadvertently, excludes students from being part of that process, right? And there are
Yeah. That's
lots
good.
of reasons for that. But even when we look at schools today, a lot of what we see, we still see remnants of the industrialized model of education, right?
Yeah.
And, when I think about now where we are with AI, for example, right? And how that's changing so rapidly and how we're thinking about schools, what does that mean for how we're rethinking what types of skills are necessary for students, what types of things we're focusing on? And it always feels like we're trying to catch up so that we're relevant. But unfortunately, in schools, a lot of times our inclusion of students um, is oftentimes tokenistic. The kind of leadership roles that they take are things like, planning pep rallies, and not really involved in curriculum and instructional design and having a voice at the table. And so that was the consistent piece that we were looking at throughout the program, alongside Simeon Fang and Judy Walton, of course. Um, and just, it was an incredible opportunity to really engage with people outside of my own work context, um, and to get different perspectives and to just really be around role models who inspired and shaped my thinking.
Good. That's good. I'm tempted to just drive on to the next part of that, Liesel, but if I could, just one more question. Thinking about your role previously in education before you completed your dissertation in practice, what were some of your experiences with student voice that maybe queued up your curiosity about student voice? What were some of the limitations or the challenges that you ran into with trying to implement that during this what seems to be really long run in education? I was reading in the bio, it said something about Morocco.
Yes.
What?
Morocco, I found a way, usually every summer while I was teaching. I was a high school English teacher for the first part of my career. And so I found some sort of international teaching fellowship each summer to sort of explore the world. And honestly, it was one of the most rewarding experiences and life changing opportunities for me to really get to explore different places through the lens of education, and to see how in different places around the world, we're grappling with similar questions, but contextualized to the different cultures and places that we got to experience, with like real on the ground places you would not visit if you were just going in as a tourist. And so we got to stay with families and see what their schools were like. A couple of years ago, I was in Tanzania post COVID, and we got to see how schools there responded during the pandemic, which was fascinating to me because they didn't have the kind of technology that we were able to utilize during that time, although I know that it was fragmented.
Hmm.
Um, but there was no other option but to just pause school. And so the
Yeah.
teachers at the school that we were at decided they were going to use the space next to the school and cultivate the land so that um, they could grow crops right on the school grounds. And so when students were able to come back the next year and a half or so, they had a fully sustainable farm right connected to the school. And the students used that as part of their learning. And they also used the food for their lunches.
Oh, wow.
And there wasn't the time to have, like, I
Mhm.
remember at that point, and I was just starting as principal as COVID was happening, right? And so there were so many debates about what we should be doing and what we shouldn't
Yeah.
be doing. And,
Yeah.
um, you know, it's interesting to see how in that space where, there was no other option, they really were able to just focus on how they could innovate with what they had and
Yeah.
were able to take that moment and create something that is still sustained and really brought together the teachers and the community in a way that was really uplifting.
Awesome.
So I don't know if that answered your question because I think I
That
got.
that was fabulous though.
But student
So
voice has always been
yeah,
at the heart because that's what we talked about.
yeah.
How did I get started? So I was an English teacher, and I always it's funny because when I grew up in school, English and literature was actually like the toughest subject for me. Like science and math actually came easier to me because it felt like I could grasp the concepts and there wasn't a lot of room for interpretation and
Yeah. Yeah.
right. And so in my English courses, I oftentimes like questioned and wondered and had a harder time, but in that way it made me more excited to learn, right? But I
Mhm.
also thought like a lot of the classic texts that we teach, without having them become relevant to students and their lives, it's lost, right? And so I
Mm.
found
It's good.
the challenge of being an English teacher and the most exciting part of like including students in thinking up ideas, whether that was like projects they were creating or um, new ways to think about like themes of text that on the surface seem outdated, was like one of the most exciting parts I think
Yeah.
of teaching for me. And so thinking about like how do we leverage that more so that students, while they need support in being able to uplift their voices, um, they're oftentimes not included. And so
Yeah.
what does it look like to include them in a way that provides a sense of structure and um, formality to where their space is in the process?
Mhm. Good.
That's awesome. I think you had a couple of different research sites in your research. What what were some of the kind of ahas that you found? What did it look like from site to site across Michigan?
Yeah, so each site had a little bit of a different sort of flavor, right?
Mhm.
Different parts of the state, but also different types of um, research settings. So one was, in the context of, a school leadership sort of course. Another was more building wide. My area was more so in the context of the classroom, and what it looked like to include students in the design process of curriculum. And so I had developed a course at the time called Contemporary Multicultural Voices, in a lot of ways, um, an inspiration from a lot of the global, travel and background. And so what we did was we trained students that were part of a curriculum council, and we talked about sort of what goes into thinking about and planning lessons, how they were designed, and getting some of their feedback. What was interesting was, they designed surveys that they would provide to their peers. And part of it was, you're part of this council and you're sharing your thoughts and your perspectives, but you're also a representative for all of the students enrolled in this course, right? And so the biggest aha moment for me was when they were going through the responses from their peers and they were getting feedback on, what do they think of X project, right? And when they looked at the responses and saw the wide range of responses, they were surprised because they oftentimes think of things like everyone loved it or everyone hated it, right? And when they went through and saw the different ways that it impacted students, um, they really gained like a deeper sense of appreciation for what teachers go through as they're designing and planning lessons, right? And we grappled with questions of like, okay, so are we designing this so that everyone loves it? Or like for the people that didn't like a certain project, how do we reframe like the purpose of that project so that they still understand the value of it? And so it was like an incredible moment in the process where they were making meaning of the responses that they were seeing, and they were responding back to their peers in a way that like didn't have them feeling like they needed to have all the answers, but that they could share the complexity of responses and could report out and dispel like some of the ideas that like this was a project that everyone loved or this was a project that everyone didn't like, and they felt more comfortable in those sort of gray areas trying to figure out what did this mean to another person. And so when we looked at like their suggestions for redesign, because we'd have a process at the end where we would look at, because one of the things that came up was they said like teachers might ask for like our perspective at the end of the course, and then we never really get to see whether or not those perspectives are actually included in the next iteration of the course. And so we did this sort of unit by unit, and one of the questions was like, how do we think about this unit for future classes, but then how do we think about what we've learned to apply to our next unit, so that they could see that we were experimenting with what students were asking for, um, right in the class that they were part of, right? And so they felt like their perspectives, that their involvement was directly impacting the learning experiences that they were having in real time. And I saw motivation and engagement skyrocket because of that, because they were included and because they were part of what we looked at with like when we did the first part of the literature review was that integrating student voice um, comes with its barriers, right? Because
That's true.
even for teachers, there are misperceptions around like what we think when we think about student voice. And so
Mhm.
some teachers or parents think like, so are students going to override the perspective of the educator?
Yeah.
That's not the case, right? You're collaborating and everyone has a role. And that means that our roles may look a little different, but it does not negate the role of the educator. In fact, I think it elevates it because it gave me the opportunity to help students understand the thought that goes into what we're creating, right? And what the intention was behind it and how it connects to how they learn, which like is another part of, I think, education that we miss with students. Like we don't necessarily make explicit the design for learning with students
Mm.
um, that they're fascinated by and that they love. They love learning about how they learn. And so you can take that and include them in that process and have them understand there were times where, you know, I ultimately, as the educator in the room, students may have called for one thing and I still decided to move forward in another way because I knew from an educational perspective that and knowing the research around strong pedagogy and teaching that we were going to move forward in another way, but I could help explain to them why that way was a way I was deciding to move forward, right? So I was using my knowledge in that space to help them understand when I couldn't meet exactly what they may have been asking for, and still find ways to honor that, right? In any way I could, but it helped them appreciate the work that the teacher was doing, um, and it gave them like a sense of like, okay, even if I don't like doing this thing, I understand why I'm doing it and why you've designed it for us, and I'm more
That's
willing to give it my best shot.
that's good. Dr. Hakeem, so we get the opportunity to talk to a lot of different people um who were in our program and our research and did their dips and things of that nature. But what's been really cool to hear you talk about your project is it seemed like you had a lot of fun.
I
Um,
did.
just go just going through it. So I got excited thinking about it. But I do have a follow-up question. We have all five listeners of the pod. I imagine I imagine are not scholars, but actually work in the field. And they're trying to figure out how to integrate and implement some of these great big ideas that have been discussed by our guests. As you think about your work around student voice and maybe think about maybe a principal, what does it look like to try to incorporate or maybe highlight student voice in some ways that could meaningfully have legs in classrooms? How do we systematize that kind of approach to student learning?
It's a great question. I think so. When I was assistant principal at Seaholm High School, we began a student voice advisory board
Oh, wow.
where we brought students from across grade levels and we asked teachers for recommendations of students that represent a variety of social circles, performance levels, interests to be part of this board. And we met with them consistently to provide them with some training around what does student voice look like. But one of the biggest aha moments for me when meeting with those students, we know all schools have school improvement goals, right, across our state. The students on the board were surprised and had no idea that we had these school improvement goals that all of us were working on in the spaces outside of students, right? Um, in all of our staff meetings and all of our professional learning sessions, we were designing all of our thinking and work around those three goals. And yet, students had no idea that that was what their teachers and the staff in the building were working to support. And so, taking that first step, however it looks, even in just terms of bringing awareness to what are the goals that you're working on from an instructional standpoint, and are students aware of those goals, um, is something that is a low lift, right? and something that you don't even need to set up an advisory board to do, right? So I would say any sort of way that you could start to build awareness for students in student friendly language of the work that's happening to support learning is a critical first step. Everything sort of built on that. So, because of that, we invited students to staff meetings where we asked them to go out and talk to at least 5 different students during lunch about one of those 3 school improvement goals. And they came back in a staff meeting and we did a sort of fishbowl discussion space. And we needed to make sure that everyone felt safe, teachers and students included, and have them share out not just their thoughts, but also the thoughts of their peers, right? With an understanding of the fact that not everybody sees the same issue the same way. And it just the act of making those students aware and having them go out to talk to other students about this and get their perspective gave a signal to the students that one, their voices were important, that two, we were working on goals as a school that had an instructional focus that helped them understand more of what their teachers were trying to implement into their classes and gave us valuable real-time feedback about whether or not we were moving in the right direction or not, and what we could do to try and perhaps shift our strategy so that we were making a strong impact, right? We're doing that work as teachers, as educators in that space during those school improvement meetings, right? Why not use that space to make it as relevant to the students as possible, right? And this was a way that really helped do that. And after teachers, I think, felt comfortable when they saw it in person, um, embraced it more, right? And saw that it was not, you know, overriding their identity as a teacher, as an educator, as the experts in the classroom of teaching and pedagogy, but it really helped augment and complement the work that we were doing.
That's so good. I think about like that continuum of student voice from like asking them about like surveys, right? Or an exit ticket or pair share to like really intentionally being engaged in planning instruction. What did you notice about once students became more involved in those continuous improvement goals? How did you started talking a little bit about this? How did it change teachers' hearts and minds, or actually like instructional practices in the classroom?
That's a great question. So I think teachers were referencing a lot of what would come up in those student voice sessions when I would
Mhm.
meet with them pre-post evaluation, right? And would talk about like what they heard students say and
Mhm.
how they were responding to that into the classroom and how they were making that evident for students in the classroom, um, which I think increased students' level of like engagement and feeling like the work that they were doing in their classrooms was relevant, right? Um, we also talked about like differentiating the idea of like student noise, which is like ranting and complaining, versus student voice, which is inquiry focused and has us grappling with differing perspectives on a continuum, right? That sometimes make it difficult to think about how to utilize that information in a way that um, is responding to the needs of all students, but it's a step in the direction of what it means to build a community, right? And part of our work in educating students is also to prepare them for what it's like to live in a democratic society, right? And so you don't always get everything you want in a democratic society, but the people's voices matter, right? And we've
Mhm.
got to look at the complexity that exists and make informed decisions about how to move forward, given what we're hearing from those that we're impacting most, which is our students. And so I think from a culture perspective, I saw things shift and change, that students had a more active role in thinking about their schools as a community, as a microcosm of like the larger system, um, and what it looks like to navigate those spaces so that their voices are at least elevated and heard and being thought about and talked about openly.
So powerful. Wow. Well, we
So
really do also want to get into the current work. Like, I feel like we could talk student voice and like, I just, I'm thinking about all the continuous work that I do and making a connection, with the districts that I serve and sharing this with them, right? Like that's super powerful and relevant. But I wanted to kind of pivot and,
well, Lisa,
while
I will
okay, yeah, one
say
more question.
I will say that I started pulling up some student surveys and I'm like, okay, I probably need to make sure we have a better job of just filtering in. At least at some point in time, we can ask some questions about my KIP and student voice and not this podcast, but we need to come back to that. Go ahead and ask your question, Dr. Carlson.
Well, I want us to get a little bit of time to think about like how, you've shared with us some of the different contexts in which you've worked, your research context, and how that's influenced you. And you've done a major professional pivot in the last few years
Mhm,
and
mhm.
are really working to support learning in a completely different way with the Detroit Public Television. And I really
Yeah.
wanted to dig into that. Like, talking about your role and how has your career as an educator and school leader influenced that role. So I want to be able to spend some time in that space too.
Yeah, another great question. So, um, at the time when I saw this role sort of emerge, I was not thinking about a career in public media, but I saw that not only Detroit PBS, but all of the PBS stations across Michigan at the time, this was post COVID, had developed a platform called the Michigan Learning Channel, which is a 24/7 broadcast channel that was initially created to provide content across the state, highly educational, aligned to standards, that would be able to access families that did not have access to broadband, right? In many of the rural parts of our state in particular. And since then, it's sort of grown into this statewide partnership and collaboration to align with what the state is working on, um, in terms of thinking about outcomes for students. So we know and we are hearing that literacy and early literacy in particular are sort of key spaces where our state is working, um, to see improvements, right? And so what the Michigan Learning Channel was designed to do and what it is doing now is trying to support what schools are doing, because we know that schools can't do this work on their own, right? And we need critical partnerships and places that, are helping to elevate the kinds of tools and resources that they have to think about how they can be used to support what schools are trying to do. And that's exactly what I saw happening in this space. So all of our public media stations collaborated with MAISA, the Michigan Association of Intermediate Schools, created a show called Read, Write, Roar, which is based on the literacy essentials, integrates foundations of the science of reading, features Michigan certified teachers teaching. Um, And so we took like what we had as a public media station, the ability to create a show, um, paired alongside the educators and the organizations who were experts in that space to design something that could complement classroom instruction or that we really use for family engagement and have seen some incredible initial impacts through an evaluation that we had done with High Scope, where we go into communities that are underserved to provide families in particular with tools that help them to support their children's learning at home. And so our work and our team in particular, we are all former school educators. And so the thing that I've really appreciated about Detroit PBS and the public media infrastructure across our state has been the fact that they've asked for educators to be working there so that they are at the table making sure that our tools and our resources are responding to those in schools. And so it felt like a shift that actually in certain ways has me more connected to schools than when I was working directly in them, which is kind of odd, right?
Awesome.
Um, and at the same time helps us get into places and spaces where as a system we may not be involved. So we have a sort of our education team, we're really working to build a cradle to career model, right? And a lot of our work skews young. And so we're working with families from the very start. At the May 19th, we've got an event, a welcome baby shower for families at New St. Paul and in Brightmoor, where we bring families together and provide them with content that they as adults can use to help support building their children's reading brains from birth onward, right? And so I often felt like even thinking about, being a high school English teacher, if we could only be part of this process earlier, right? And so I was a building principal in a school grades 3 through 8. And now I'm like, if we could only even get in earlier, and we know those first 3 years of life are critical
Yeah.
in the development of the brain. Um, and we don't spend a lot of time taking that seriously as a PK through 12 system because structurally it's outside the scope of what we are quote unquote responsible for, right? And so I think there's a huge gap in not really thinking about how we're forming relationships with families earlier, even though it may not be the group at that time that we're asked to serve, that we need to start thinking differently about how we're creating, as leaders in particular, I think of schools, how we're engaging with families earlier to help parents set their children up so that they're ready for school, so that when they enter school, their ability to reach even the most insurmountable learning targets, right, becomes possible because they've set the right foundation. And families across communities, you know, are thirsty for what they can do to build a life for their child where they're going to have a successful school experience. And I've seen that in some of the most underserved communities that I've been able to work with in this role. That's been very different than some of my experiences prior to. Um, and to recognize, the barriers and the challenges that they face and how some of our tools and resources are able to help support them during those times that are challenging.
Well, Dr. Omar, we try to try to make sure that we disclaim with saying things like we don't intend to or politicize this pod at all, but it becomes increasingly more complicated um, during every show because there seems to be some particular thing happening just downstream, working to disrupt some of the really important things happening in our community. One of the things that we had heard of earlier on in this year were that there are going to be some cuts to public broadcasting. I'm wondering if any of the national kind of hullabaloo about public um, broadcasting has impacted this work in any tangible ways. And are there any things that we could do to um, better partner with our local public broadcasting station to make sure that we have access to really dope programming like Read, Write, Roar. My God, Mom, I need to say this is Robin Pizzo,
Yeah, I know
and
that she
and
is
on
amazing.
call, she just drops off Read, Write, Roar stuff. So, but yeah, go ahead and answer that question, Dr. Omar.
Yeah, so that's a complicated question because we've
Yeah.
been hit on both the federal level, where
Mm,
funding has been rescinded, and also at the state level in this past year for the Michigan Learning Channel. So we are working our way, hopefully, to be included in the next school aid budget for the Michigan Learning Channel.
mhm,
We have been included in the governor's recommended budget, which is
mhm.
exciting. Um, However, I think there is perhaps a lack of understanding of one, like from an education perspective, the way that resources on affiliated with public media, educational public media, are created. I've developed a tremendous respect for, when a new show or new content is created, the types of experts that are part of the development of that process to ensure that the content is created with educational value, which is
Can you
very.
give us an example? Because my daughters watch PBS every morning, and there's always a new show coming on.
That's amazing. Yeah. So the shows, for example, think of Molly of Denali. That
Yeah.
was a specific show that was created to address the need to support students accessing informational text, right? Which is an area we know students struggle with most, right? And
Yeah.
so researchers and folks in that space were brought to the table as the design of that show was created. And they verify the impact of that show with studies. That's where a lot of some of the funding that is going to support a lot of these initiatives at the federal level were supplied through what was called Ready to Learn, which was a grant that brought researchers, educators, members of the community together to create shows with a very specific educational focus.
Wow.
And they're designed alongside multiple iterations of feedback from focus groups and community members and folks in the education space to ensure that the content quality is focused primarily on its educational value. So the thing about a public media system is that we don't have the kind of commercial or corporate influence that other tools and resources may have. So if you're watching your local PBS station, you're not going to see traditional commercials. You'll see sponsorships from corporations, but it is one of the most independent content creation spaces that has this balance of locally created content as well as nationally created content through the PBS system that supports learning. And I'm just talking about the education content, not all the other pieces. Um, what is interesting is that each station sort of has their own pool of tools and resources. So Detroit PBS fortunately has a large donor base. We're in the center of, a city where there are many philanthropic donors who are interested in supporting the work that we're doing on the ground. But then you've got another Michigan Learning Channel station and Northern Michigan University that does not have that same donor base. They do not have the same type of philanthropic interest or support. And so you actually see a lot of the rural stations across the nation suffering the most and are most impacted by the rescission to funding public media. And so, what can you do? The more noise that you make with your local legislators, the better. The Michigan Learning Channel really strives to be an apolitical space. We are about, providing tools and resources for learning to support families and educators at no cost to the end user, right? And so public support of your public media stations is also key. Not If you're not donating to your public media station, you should, even if it is the smallest amount, because it shows the kind of public support that exists for the station. So, what has been affirming has been, in this past year, we've had more new donors than we've seen in the past recent history of public media. And that's because individuals are showing up and providing that level of support. Now, we're worried about what sustaining looks like. However, the more people that are part of your system makes a stronger case to legislators, to philanthropic donors, that this is a valuable tool and resource that we need to continue supporting. And so sometimes you kind of think like, is a small donation really going to make an impact? Absolutely. In this case, it is, even your just the acknowledgement of a contribution and is representation that this is, something that we value and that we don't want to see dismantled.
So powerful, right? The common good.
Absolutely. And there, I mean, that's just the education space, right?
Right.
Thinking about the journalism space and arts
Yeah.
and culture and all of the other,
This old
places
house.
where public media is
This old house.
providing. Yeah, exactly. And
This
we're
old
so much
house.
beyond the screen too. So
Yeah.
last year, for example, the Michigan Learning Channel, with all of our engagement coordinators across the state, we had 414 in-person events across the state where we were distributing resources to families, where we know family engagement is a struggle. But when you bring Clifford or Elmo to a literacy event, you attract different kind of attention, right?
Absolutely.
And
Absolutely.
parents and families are excited to be there to learn more about what you have to offer and what kinds of tools and resources you can provide.
Wow. So if I'm a school leader like Chris, who doesn't have a godmother who drops
Oh.
off resources for Read,
Is that
Write, Roar,
even nepotism?
and say, for example, I'm thinking of some of the schools I support in Saginaw County, Genesee County. If we look at, hey, I want to provide my families with some resources, many times schools will send home like summer learning packets. Like, how could I get connected with Michigan Learning Channel and really be able to provide some free open access materials for my families and scholars for the summer?
That's perfect. So if you go to michiganlearning.org, you will actually see in the banner of our website, which we're also working on we redesigned the website and we're working again on a refresh. We're working with focus groups of educators and families across the state to get their feedback on how they best use resources, what should it look like, so that again, we're really responding to the needs of the end user. But we have a summer learning program that we offer each year. And so if you go to the website and you click on the banner that will take you to, you'll see some Read, Write, Roar literacy resources, but then you will see the link to the summer learning program. And we've got 3 different books that are curated for different levels. So we've got an early learners book that's pre-K and kindergarten. We've got early elementary that's first through third, and then upper elementary that's fourth through sixth. And they're intended to be engaging activities that are supplemented with educational media. So on certain pages, you'll see QR codes that you can scan that will allow you to view, a short clip of something, and then asks you to do something to explore, to learn, and then capture your thoughts. We offer those books for free to download as a PDF on the site. And then we developed a relationship with our printing company because we received the request from organizations we thought like, okay, if we provide the PDFs, then schools and organizations can figure out how to get them printed. But our printing company offered us the rate that is at the lowest cost that you would actually need to purchase like a significant number of books in order to get the rate to provide it for schools and organizations that want to order them over the summer. So they are like around $2.35 per copy and have an incredible wealth of tools and resources. And again, if you want to print them on your own, those PDFs are there and available. Or if you want to order them directly from the standard printing folks that we have a relationship with, you can do that at the bulk cost.
Hey, well, with that said, you have given us almost an hour of just gold, just gold. But we want to get ready to wrap up the show because at this point in time, you've been up since 7, and if you're like me, there's no caffeine in this cup of yours.
See, I got my caffeine, so
Okay, okay, all right.
I'm
Well,
revved up.
touche. But we always land on this question, and we want to throw it at you. Just quick disclaimers. I'm going to ask you about a book. There are a couple of these aren't quite our banned book list. It's just tired book list. The every page has been dog-eared. And so we're done with actually no, I didn't dog-ear that book. So no Brene Brown, no vulnerability of armor, vulnerability. Other books, what are some other books that we are tired of, Lisa? Can we do that? We should do that. We should make a segment, what we don't want to read anymore.
But I think Dr. Omar has a good recommendation for us.
Yes, we
What are
want to get
you
there.
reading?
Hey, real quick. I love Hattie, but if you are saying visible learning is what you're reading right now, just put it down somewhere. Can we say that? Is it all right? Go ahead and we'll end it with you. Just tell us what are you reading now?
All right. So, in the spirit of the wonder and beauty of PBS, I am reading this. When you wonder, you're learning. And it's Mr. Rogers' Enduring Lessons for raising creative, curious, caring kids by Greg Bear and Ryan Ridzowski. And I am loving it because it is fascinating to think about how it explores how Mr. Rogers, the show, was developed alongside educational researchers that you will recognize that developed it with such intentionality to support learning across those 3 domains of creativity, curiosity, and care. And as we think about sort of where we're moving and this tension between, the kinds of skills and character traits that we're trying to cultivate and the kinds of academic skills that we're also really working to support. What really is worth our time, and how do we ensure that we're not neglecting critical parts of our learning that are essential in terms of development of what children need. And so one thing I thought was really interesting so far, the part that I was just reading, was about creativity, being essential, not just for purposes of like thinking about, the impact that it has on our ability to do creative things like the arts, right? But that like it's actually essential for the survival of species. So they were talking about um, a, a group of crows in northern Japan that found a way to take walnuts and put them in front of slow moving cars so that the slow moving cars would crack the walnuts so that they could eat them. All right. And so they found a creative way in this new environment, right, to really help prevent themselves from not having a food source, right? And so in that way, like creativity can help prevent us from extinction, right? So when I thought about like AI and what we're doing now with all like the idea of like that creative lens and thinking through new possibilities and new ways to approach things, which they talk about, unfortunately, like throughout our life, like a 5-year-old has a very different relationship to creativity. As you get older, you start to censor yourself more because you care more about what other people think and how it's being perceived and whether or not it's truly of value. But cultivating that level of creativity is really critical and important to the survival of any species, right? And so I thought that example was really interesting.
So, Mr. Rogers would be so delighted to hear you talking about that. Um, I think we'll name the show, Liesel, Creativity in Crows Cracking Walnuts.
That was an amazing example.
Is that
I've got
it?
to read this book.
It's great. It's like a fresh perspective on it's really grounded in like how the Mr. Rogers show was aligned with the learning sciences. So a lot like you take the class with at that time, Dr. Cooper. Um,
Oh,
Everything that we
yeah,
learned
Chris
in that
Peterson.
book is sort of synthesized in here, but then connected to how that was reflected and elevated in the show. So yeah, fascinating stuff.
I love it. Well,
Wow,
look,
I feel like we could talk to you all day.
I could talk to you guys all day too.
Well, we're going to need to have part two, Dr. Omar.
All right,
How's
let's do
that?
it. I'm down.
All right,
Uh,
Chris, want to wrap us up?
Here we go. Well, thank you for joining us on Coffee with the Doctors, where practitioner scholars help us rethink what education can be. We'll see you next time for another conversation at the intersection of research, leadership, and practice.